Hello, team. Welcome to a very last-minute live chat, an ATP Geopolitics and Silicon Curtain joint co-stream live with myself, Jonathan M.S. Pearce, and of course, Jonathan Fink. This was really last minute. So much has been happening. We just did another little interview on a veterans show in the US. Together, Jonathan and I. He invited me onto that very kindly. And we thought, well, we're here together. Let's talk about what's been going on, because there's an awful lot that's been going on, it turns out, as there appears to be every single day. So, Jonathan, here we are. Thanks so much for this last minute one.
It is quite literally the fire hose of excrement, isn't it? I mean, there's so much going on. And a lot of it is extremely toxic and worrying. And unfortunately, you know, my 30 years of observing Russia has taught me to always try to imagine how things could be worse rather than better. So as opposed to normalizing a situation and thinking, well, you know, maybe it's not that bad, really, my brain always turns to, okay, well, what's, you know, where could this go south? How could this possibly get worse? And unfortunately, in this instance, it used to be months later. Now it is literally hours and days later that you think of something really appalling, such as Musk turning off Starlink in Ukraine, and there's no time to even sort of, you know, pause and wait and digest that, and boom, it's there in the headlines, and they're going for the very, very worst behaviors and the worst outcomes. Even if you sit there and you really sort of, you know, try to imagine how dark things could get, no, they're ticking all those boxes and they're going there. So it's
just incredible. And you know, what we're seeing happen in real time is this these fundamental changes to the security architecture of the world, and also the geopolitical landscape, whereby things that we took for granted for so long, which is the US really reliable, well, the cornerstone of NATO, the cornerstone of the West. I keep hearing people saying, oh, we in the West should cut the US off. And I'm like, the US are the West. Do you know what? We're here together. So it's just this really fascinating, but also incredibly scary time where everything we took for granted appears to be changing really quite rapidly. And that should be cause for concern an awful lot. And goodness me, there's so much to talk about just tonight.
It's incredible, isn't it? But so what that means is, I think we have to focus on what we can change individually. We have to, of course, be cynical, but we have to think about, you know, where our energies are best deployed. And my view at this point is our energies are best deployed in persuading European leaders that they, and I don't think they need a huge amount of persuasion anymore, that they need to wake up. That Ukraine is Europe's only defense against the rising authoritarianism, which, whether that is in a year's time, 2 years' time, 3 years' time, could well sweep over, break over Europe as a wave of Russian tyranny and horror, slaughter and repression. The Orwellian phrase of a boot stamping on a human face forever. That is Vladimir Putin's vision of Russia, and he won't, and Europe even, and indeed the world. He won't be around forever. He will die, but believe me, there are 1,000 Putins lining up, waiting to take over and carry on the sort of legacy that he's created. So this isn't a problem we can kind of wish away. So I think our time is well spent on that, but also on reiterating the idea that negotiations with Russia are only contingent on how big the stick is you can carry to enforce whatever agreement you might sign up. Because if you don't show the will to force, if you don't have the resources to deploy force, force that is equal or superior to the force of Russia, then all agreements are contingent. And in fact, nothing has any meaning for a state that fundamentally is lawless. It does not work on the same mechanisms and principles that Western democracy works. And I think we're still not quite wising up to that. So much talk about peace deals, but neither peace nor a deal are what Putin has in mind.
Yeah, and it's interesting you talk about rules and norms and the rule of law, etc., etc. Uh, and you know, Russia not being adherent to such norms. But actually, that's what we're seeing in the US at the moment, which is a clearing out of the judiciary, a clearing out the CIA, the FBI, a clearing out of civil servants and government employees, a clearing out of a purge of the military hierarchy, and that includes the lawyers. And in fact, the idea is that, I think, was it Pete Hegseth said, so they won't be obstacles for us doing what we want to do. So I don't think, and you've also had judges, making these, finding these conclusions or making these judgments, and the US administration not really listening to them. So the rules and norms seem to be of little consequence in the United States, and that is deeply worrying, because you're then thinking, well, goodness, the United States are looking functionally not too dissimilar from Russia. And yeah, so it's going to be a kind of circling of the wagons for Europe. It's going to be fascinating to see what happens this week, and I'll be interested in what you think, both what they should do and what they're likely to do, when you see Emmanuel Macron actually tomorrow go to the White House, and then Keir Starmer on Thursday, given that Andrzej Duda from Poland has just been to the White House, thought to be a strong advocate of Trump and a strong ally of Trump, was made to wait an hour and a half outside Trump's door and was given only 10 minutes instead of the hour meeting he was expecting. So that was a humiliation. So what do you think will happen with Macron and Starmer, and what do you think they should do?
Unfortunately, I think the optics of this are not going to be good, and I think Starmer will not make public displays of countering Trump or disagreeing with him. It'll be very sort of diplomatic and behind closed doors. But I think they are going to get the same kind of treatment. They're going to be subject to slights and things that sort of seek to diminish their status. And elevate Trump's. He wants to demonstrate where he thinks, they are in the pecking order and where he is. If you look at those photo ops of Biden and others, it's a very different dynamic. You don't get the sense of, the US president sort of storming in and I'm the big boss here, and there's, it's colleagues meeting, it's peers meeting as part of the same alliance. No, Trump has a very different dynamic. He wants to be the big boss. He looks around. I know this is in simplistic sort of playground terms, but unfortunately, I think this is this is the way his mind works. He looks at Xi, he looks at Putin, he looks at Kim Jong-un and their behaviors and their attitudes and their sort of dictator swagger. And he's like, yeah, I want some of that. Okay, what do I have to do to be part of this gang? Taking countries and their resources, strong arming them into rapacious deals, deconstructing all the checks and balances of his own state. This is all dictator 101 stuff. And I think he's looking at it not because he necessarily understands that these things are absolutely necessary. He just thinks that, okay, these are the things that the people I admire do. Well, I should be allowed to do them too. So I don't hold out much for this meeting, unfortunately. I hope that he insults them. I hope that it is grotesque and humiliating, and they come back with their faces slapped, properly slapped, because they need waking up. And they need to understand that they cannot go living on, la-la land fantasies that somehow the US is still part of NATO and the transatlantic alliance and blah, blah, blah. That is gone. That is absolutely gone.
Yeah, it's interesting, because I think the likelihood, as you probably think, is that they'll go and try and appease Trump, try and cozy up to Trump and do the whole, yeah, no, you're really cool, but I think we can make this work. We can make this work together. And I just don't think you're going to change Trump's mind now. I think he's intransigent, and he surrounded himself, as a really, really very good article that everyone should go and read. It's in Politico. It's called MAGA Takes Aim at the Republican Hawks. It is absolutely fascinating. And it talks about how there are these people around Trump, like the Project 2025 people. And then you've got those that are slightly more savvy about Ukraine, such as Keith Kellogg, to a degree, Marco Rubio, and Mike Walls. But those two are somewhat compromised because they know that if they don't toe the party line, they'll lose their jobs to people like Rick Grenell. And so that just leaves Keith Kellogg, and Keith Kellogg has basically been sidelined. That's why he went to Kiev on his own and was basically ignored and then told not to have a press conference afterwards. So in other words, Project 2025 are winning. That I've talked for weeks and weeks about how there's tension in the White House between these two I guess worldviews, geopolitical worldviews, and the Project 2025 ones are winning. They've won. Indeed, and they're just out for a mineral deal with Ukraine that will screw Ukraine over. And we're going to talk about this in a second because Zelensky's spoken today, and there's a lot to take away from that, including comments on that. But I think one really interesting takeaway point from this article is here. This is Brad Bowman, a GOP staffer who worked with Rubio in the Senate, is now a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense Democracy, said, quote, "We're in the midst of a fight for the soul of the Republican Party generally, and especially on foreign policy." I mean, this is a fight for the Republican Party, and Heritage Foundation, who wrote the Project 2025, who have, I think, control of Trump and his administration, they have won. Now, what will be interesting is to see whether that set of people will end up realizing they shot themselves in the foot by having the allies of the US dump on US and go it alone. So back to your point about how, or the question about how Starmer and Emmanuel Macron should act, I think they should, but they won't. I think they should just go to the White House, all guns blazing, and just go, "Hey, Trump, if you don't do what we say, if we have all this leverage, we've got political and economic leverage. The EU has more of a population than the US. We have a comparable GDP and economy as the US. We have huge reach. And do you know what? We can say to you, you need to be doing this. And if you don't do this, then this will happen." And I think we should go all guns blazing to the White House and just take it to Trump and then see what he says and say, look, if you don't help Ukraine in the way that you should be helping Ukraine, frickin' screw you, mate. We're going to take you to, we're going to cut you loose, and that will hurt you.
That makes me think of the Eric Idle line, "We'll take you to the effing cleaners, mate." Yeah. But I think they should do that. And because this is sort of what Zelenskyy is doing at the moment. Zelenskyy is, in a polite but firm way, is telling Trump to go F himself, or to go and rethink his deals, his extortion deals, come back with something more reasonable and measured, and then we can talk, then we have a dialogue. I think it's that kind of firm rebuttal which is important at this point, because what we get wrong about Putin, and what the West has got wrong about Putin over and over and over again, is that somehow dialogue and words are going to change his mind, when it's only force and strength that get his attention, or have any hope of resetting his calculations. I think Trump has tapped into that. So if you go with an appeasing point of view, if you go with a conciliatory point of view, if you go with normal kind of outreach and diplomacy, he's going to have nothing but contempt for you. You are worse than invisible to him. You're absolutely worthless as far as he's concerned. So the only way is to show strength in negotiations, strength in the hand you take, firmness to stick to it. He won't understand the values that underpin that behavior, but he will take note of strength and resistance. And then his business instincts kick in. It'd be like, oh, okay, we got a hard customer here. Right. Then you're making him think. Then you're making him reorient his strategy. Then you're maybe getting concessions out of him. You have to think like you're going into a particularly tough business deal and not some piece of diplomacy. And you have to play games with that. And you have to show that you are tough and that you're not desperate. I mean, all my years of business showed me that the minute, it comes to a point like in the month where you're kind of worried about, like, we really need this deal, guys. We need this deal, or we're going to have to say fire people, So what do? You go into the next sales opportunity and you reek of desperation and you give concessions and you cut your price and you don't win that deal. Why? Because they can smell desperation on you. And there's nothing less attractive than sort of appeasement and desperation to get a deal. Now, if you go in there with the air like take it or leave it, I mean, it's, this is more important for you than it is for us. Okay, we're the best guys for the job, but take it or leave it. We got, business coming out of our ears. I think that's the kind of attitude you have to take with him. Fairly bullshit. Trouble is, the Europeans, especially Starmer, are not particularly adept, I think, at doing this.
And this is where we can segue on to talking about Germany, because interestingly, good reminder, for tonight, I'm going to be drinking some Coburn Special Reserve Port, or Coburns, but not, as my children would say, as annoying teenagers. Of course, they'd call it something different. But luckily, they're obviously in bed now.
Well, this is my absolute favourite, and this is actually the very last of it. I poured out the final dregs of the bottle here. So if anyone's feeling particularly generous and wants to give my favourite whiskey, no, I'm joking. That's a joke. Buy drones instead. Don't buy whiskey for me. Donate to drones. Donate to Ukraine. They need it more.
Yes, this is true. But on the off chance you are just feeling generous, like that's the whiskey. No.
Although we do, if he's listening, we do know somebody who owns a whiskey shop, don't we? So Mark.
Well, I did send Mark a
This is
message.
good stuff, Mark. This is good stuff.
I'm sure he's well in bed. So Germany have just had an election, and it has gone okay, I guess, in terms of your larger view of politics. In terms of Ukraine, pretty good. And the results have been 28.5% for the CDU, who are a centre-right party. Unfortunately, the far-right party have moved into second place, the AfD, who are anti-Ukraine and pro-Russia. Broadly speaking, 20.5%, 16.4%. This is an exit poll, so it could change. 16.4% for the SPD, who are essentially the ruling party, although they're in the traffic light coalition with the Greens on 12%. They've gone down a bit, and this yellow, the FPD, who have gone down quite a bit. So essentially, if you add up what the SPD and what the FDP have lost, that's what the AfD have gained, broadly speaking. Another party that has done well is Die Linke, which is a left-wing party. And I was wondering, because BSW is this Sarah Wagenknecht party, who are actually anti-Ukraine as well, but actually, so she splintered off from the left, and I think the left, or Die Linke, has changed their policy on Ukraine and might be a bit more pro-Ukraine at the moment. But anyway, what you're likely to see is what's called, is it the Grosser coalition, the CDU getting together with the SPD and the Greens, because they've refused to go into coalition with the AfD, which means that you would have probably a very pro-Ukrainian stance. Now, what's interesting here with regard to what Jonathan Fink was just saying is that, and interestingly, Donald Trump's come out and said, oh, how wonderful, yeah, it's great, even though previously he is much more in favor of AfD, but he's been singing the praises of CDU, of course. But it's some of the very strong things that Friedrich Merz has said. So, quote, look at these recent interventions into Germany by Mr. Elon Musk. Interventions from DC are no less drastic and brazen than those from Moscow. We are massively under pressure from two sides. Right, the future chancellor of Germany has just said we're as much under threat from the US as we are from Moscow. So if you're wondering about, you were just talking, Jonathan, about, well, the EU needs to be strong, Europe needs to be strong. That is strong rhetoric right there. A few other things. My absolute priority will be to achieve independence from the US. From the latest statements made last week, it becomes clear that the US is relatively indifferent to the future of Ukraine. Wow, that's another big statement. And another one here. I'm not certain how the White House will position itself in the coming weeks. My impression over the last few days is that Russia and America are finding common ground over the heads of Ukraine, and thus also over the heads of Europe. That is why everyone is now looking at Germany. How quickly will the Germans be able to form a government after this complicated election result? That is really my priority now. And finally here, Torsten Benner saying, absolutely, Merz is saying, absolutely no illusions about Trump. The goal needs to be step-by-step independence from the US, who, quote, pretty much no longer cares about the fate of the EU. Unclear whether we still speak of NATO in its present shape by the time of the June summit, or whether we need to come up with a European alternative. So these are massive statements from Friedrich Merz there, which really throws a cat among the pigeons, but probably in a good way. We were just talking about how Macron and Starmer need to go and slap Trump around the face if they go to the White House. They won't do that, but Merz is sounding like he's actually doing that already.
It's extraordinary. It's not what we expect from German politicians, but it is extremely welcome. It's like a cold shower, I think, for many. And I think one of the challenges is the media will tend to normalize the situation if they're getting these, downbeat normalizing signals from politicians. And despite what's happened over the last 3 years in Ukraine, and we're entering the third anniversary, there has been a tendency to play down the global significance of what Russia's done, to not scare domestic markets and economies, stock markets and so on, and to try to look at this as a regional problem rather than a global problem. Well, things have changed dramatically. We've been saying this is the direction they're going in for 3 years, Jonathan. Finally, the world has caught up. But it's when you have leading politicians like Merz say this, then you'll find the mainstream media suddenly get on the bandwagon and take it seriously. Now, there are some exceptions to these. Times Radio has followed this over the last 3 years and had lots of excellent guests on, people that you and I have spoken to as well. You have, Telegraph, the latest, which is a brilliant piece of journalism, which again, from day one, has been emphasizing the global nature of the threat and highlighting, the issues of appeasement. So it's not that these things don't exist, but they've been catering to what I would call the pro-Ukraine bubble. We need mainstream politicians to literally start sort of screaming that everything needs to change. And by everything, I mean, we are now firmly in that 1938, 1939 point where if you don't rearm, then you're going to be lunch for people who are rapidly rearming. And of course, Russia, despite its parlous performance on the battlefield, has not just replenished its troop numbers and rebuilt them back up again. It has alliances with countries that could potentially help it to rebuild its armory. If the US flips entirely, and this is no longer a crazy concept, we could find the US building back Putin's war machine, not just financially, but with machine tools, components, and even armor. I mean, this is the topsy-turvy world which we're heading towards. So I think, yes, there may well be some form of negotiated peace or pause or freezing of the full-scale conflict, but that freeze could last as little as a year before Putin believes that he is sufficiently replenished, rearmed and resourced to try again.
And that's why security guarantee is absolutely necessary. I just want to read one more quote from Merz. This is Republicans Against Trump saying that he has said, quote, "I am communicating closely with a lot of prime ministers and heads of EU states. And for me, it is an absolute priority to strengthen Europe as quickly as possible so that we achieve independence from the US step by step." So it's a fuller quote from what we heard earlier. "I never thought that I would ever need to say something like that on television. But after the latest statements made by Donald Trump last week, it's clear that the Americans, at any case, these Americans, wow, that's really strong. These Americans, this administration, mostly don't care about the fate of Europe one way or the other." That to me is fighting talk. That is like, and that's realism there. That is like, let's not beat around the bush. They've slagged us off. They're being a bunch of dicks. And they're also not being very nice to Ukraine. So let's acknowledge that and say, right, we need to make Europe stronger, and we got to deal with you guys being those people. Yeah. And when I say that, I mean the Trump administration. That to me is absolutely fascinating.
From a German leader, this is beyond all expectation. I mean, when we were talking earlier, I mean, Scholz has got some considerable flack, especially for not sending tourists and so on. But if you look at the numbers, Germany has provided an awful lot more than the UK, for instance.
Yeah.
And what is not discussed that much is Germany has actually been building some vast armaments factories on the territory of Ukraine, allowing them. There's a lot of stuff. There's a lot of stuff going on there. Scholz has not been as weak behind the scenes as he has painted.
I agree, and I've said this an awful lot, is that people get wrapped up with the whole tourist thing and think that's somehow representative of what Germany have been doing. Germany have been absolutely fantastic. If it wasn't for Germany, Ukraine would be screwed, because after the US, Germany have been the biggest supplier, and actually they're putting a lot more of these long-term things in place, like you say, like it's Rheinmetall and Armin Parpiger, the CEO of Rheinmetall, who have really been at the forefront of supporting Ukraine, not just in the short term, but in the long term as well, building these factories, and not just in Ukraine as well, building factories in the Baltics and over Europe to really support Ukraine in the long term. Let's now go to. So today there was the Ukraine annual forum 2025 forum. It's where basically they'll get together and talk about the war and stuff. That's a really bad description of what they've done, but you've had an awful lot of pretty important people today. I don't know, have you got some beeping machinery in the background there?
Oh yes, that's the dishwasher. Yeah.
It'll
stop it. It'll stop it.
Yeah, so a lot of people said some very interesting things today. Budanov, the intelligence chief, and all sorts of other commentators as well. I think Zelenskyy too. But you had, I think, the most important statements came from a Zelenskyy who was being pretty frank, whilst also, I think, being quite diplomatic in the way he said things, but still very, very strong. I have got a summary. If you don't mind, we'll go through these points, Jonathan, and see what you think. So this is the third anniversary of Russia's full-scale invasion. The open press conference today, RBK summed up the main points of the journalists' questions. I have posted the translation. Impressive how relaxed, but also how willing to answer in depth the president was. Okay, let's go through some of these. An important summit will take place tomorrow, February 24th. 13 partners will come to Kyiv and another 24 will join online. So that's a lot of European leaders will be in Kyiv tomorrow. So that's important. If you really need me to leave my post, I'm ready. I can trade it for NATO. If there are such conditions, I'm not going to be in power for a decade. Now, this was a really interesting point, because this is saying, I think that is really speaking to Trump himself, who is possibly going for a third term in the US. He's wanting to rule forever. He's got that kind of air of a dictator holding on to power. Whereas Zelenskyy is saying basically to the wider world, me in this position, my power is not of the utmost importance. The utmost importance is that Ukraine gets what it needs. And if it needs NATO admission, and that requires me to leave this position as president, then God damn it, I'm going to leave that position as president, because we need to be in NATO. Any thoughts on that, Jonathan?
Yes, I mean, Zelenskyy is not a dictator, but it is a strong talking point in, Elon Musk and other circles, especially in the last week where Trump has said this over and over. It is no coincidence at all, of course, that all of this slew of Russian propaganda narratives have really peaked in the last week. And it is just a week ago that Trump spoke to Putin. He had a lengthy phone call with him. So, this is quite potentially sort of the source of some of these stories, or at least Trump will hear these from his circle, but is what he would perhaps see as the validation from Putin that has really, accelerated his repetition and acceptance, I think, of them. Or this is, again, to make certain assumptions. Maybe he just thinks they're useful. Maybe he has no belief or otherwise in what he's saying. He just sees these as a means to an end, magic words you can utter to make certain doors open for you. But I lost my train of thought. What was the question?
That's all right. We'll go on to some of the next points that he's made, which is the agreement with the US needs something that is not there yet, security guarantees. I will not sign something that will be paid for by 10 generations of Ukrainians. So this is talking directly to the minerals deal, where it's essentially extortion. Ukraine getting screwed over by the US for generations to come by signing away all their rights to their own natural resources, and the Americans give nothing. They don't give security guarantees, and in fact, it's just payment for what Biden has already given to Ukraine freely, if you like.
Except, the estimate is just 100 billion of what was received, and that wasn't received in big bundles of cash. It was received in equipment, and unfortunately, some of that equipment was old, and yet it was marked up at its sort of list price. You'd never get away with this in business, but somehow economists, dealing with military kit do get away with it. Those who work with government budgets do get away with it. That is like saying, that's like saying to the sort of, the Treasury, oh yeah, we bought a second-hand photocopier, which was worth, a tenth of a new one, but we're going to put it on our books as if it was a new piece of equipment. This is what they've done here. So even the 100 billion figure is probably quite inflated if you were to do a complete, forensic analysis of it. But he's not asking for that. He's asking for 500 billion.
Which indeed Zelenskyy spoke to by saying, look, we received not $500 billion from the US, but 100 billion. So he's really explicit about this. And I like that. But I'm not ready to recognize even 100 billion as debt because it was a grant. We had an agreement with Biden. Fascinating. So really strong. I mean, these aren't the exact words, but that's really strong, I think. Point making by Zelenskyy here, really putting the truth out there, I think, and trying to debunk what's been previously said.
I mean, I earlier today I put forward a sort of theory, and again, unfortunately, my theories have a reasonably good reliability of becoming reality, which is quite disturbing because my theories are usually quite dark and horrific. Why has he put the figure at 500 billion? Because he thinks he can get away with it, because it's a very large number that popped into his head. Also, I worry about what his thinking is. He almost certainly knows that Putin needs peace right now. He almost certainly has an equivalent deal with Putin, whether that's worth anything on paper, but he's almost certainly cut some kind of deal with Putin to potentially mine what's in eastern Ukraine as well, or to divide up the spoils of eastern Ukraine between Russia and the US. This is the bit we don't know about, but I think that's the only piece that would make this whole thing make sense. Putin needs peace to replenish his armaments. He may have a view that it's a year or two before he can kick off another full-scale war. His aim is not to now simply control Ukraine. He wants to eradicate Ukraine. He wants to eradicate its identity, its flag, its language, and every aspect that creates resilience that we've seen. He is on a genocidal mission. Let's make no mistake about it, which means a cessation of hostilities is only temporary. Well, Trump may be thinking, well, hang on a second. I may not have that long in office. I may not have that long before Russia kicks off a full-scale invasion. Well, let's go for a really big number and let's see how much we can extract in that time period. So this whole thing could be far, far worse. And in that period, he could very well work to not just dismantle the Euro-Atlantic alliance, but actually pressure European allies not to support Ukraine, not to build back up their defenses. He could actively work to rebuild Russia and thwart European efforts to defend themselves. This is one of the sort of darker scenarios, but an entirely realistic one, I think, of where we're heading.
And, obviously he knows this more than anyone. Zelenskyy knows that he needs the US on side. And so there will be an element of him that's, and I think he says it in some of his answers, where he's like, even if I get screwed over to some degree, it still might be worth it to do this deal with the US because we need the US that much. And so that's a dilemma he's in, which is, you know, how much do I give away to make sure the US is on side? But then that on sideness, I don't think is at all reliable even.
No.
So yeah, so he said also, I want a dialogue with Trump. I don't know when I will meet him. I really believe that Trump will help us end the war, but peace through force is, first of all, directing force at Russia, which is kind of a pointed point, like, you know, hey, why do you keep putting pressure on us? That pressure needs to be put on Russia. The US and Russia have always held talks during the war, so that's interesting. Previously, this was not public, so this is, in some sense, it's not anything new, slightly more formalized, but there have been talking previously, so that's interesting. Military aid from the US has not been stopped, but nothing new has been announced. There have been these rumors that they've stopped aid. A number of different people, including Honcharenko, said this, but it's not actually being true. So that's really good news. Trump is not forever, and we need peace for many years. If war returns in 10 years, it will not be easier for us. This is a really interesting point, which is to say that, you know, Trump's there, giving it all this, demanding that, really to I guess, increase his own ego and to give him a sense of, yay, look at me, I'm the big deal maker. But as far as Ukraine is concerned, that's not Zelenskyy. As far as Ukraine's concerned, like, Trump will be gone in a few years. Trump will be dead in a few years. He's an old man, right? Ukraine will be, you know, especially if a bad deal's done, where you're just, you know, prostituting your natural resources out to the highest bidder, to the, well, not the lowest bidder, to being forced to by the US, then, you know, that lasts for an awful long time, and we need to be thinking about the future here of an entire country. So, you know, sod Trump as an individual person. Let's think about the future of our people and our country.
Well, that phrase won't go down very well with him. The idea that Trump won't be here forever. I think that probably is the one phrase you could utter that would really trigger Trump's psychology. I mean, he probably fears death. He fears disease. He fears weakness. He fears mockery. So this is a particularly, if you really want to upset him, that is quite a well chosen phrase. I mean, which dictator likes to think about their mortality?
Sometimes I wonder whether they should just annoy Trump and just, you know, really, I don't know. And then I think, no, that you know, because I'm like, oh, Trump is such an egregious person and doing the wrong things. It's just like, I want to say, oh, just sod off, mate, and just really call him out for what he is, and just unite around those allies that are willing to step in and help. But then, of course, Trump will then become even more of an enemy, and that can be really, really deeply counterproductive.
Yeah. Whereas, you know, there are many tens of thousands of would-be Putins in Russia. I think Trump is dare I say, relatively original in the US context. Having said that, there are plenty of people in Trump's orbit who have bought into, you know, what you describe as the Project 2025. And there are many people who could continue that work of dividing the West and dismantling, you know, traditional US sort of statecraft and governance. So again, unfortunately, yes, Trump isn't forever, but some of the things he's doing and some of the people he's surrounded himself with, yeah, I think we're going to be with them for some time.
Yeah,
and of course they want to bring this. They want to bring this whole show to the UK, don't they? I mean,
yeah.
Part of the plan is, the
Liz
rumor
Truss
is,
wants to get Doge
you know,
involved.
the rumor. There's, yes, Liz Truss, who has no traction, fortunately, with anyone or anything, is parroting this kind of stuff in her particularly sort of inept, tone-deaf way. Unfortunately, we do have people who are, you know, rather shrewd political operators who are rumored to be part of this, like Dominic Cummings, who would love to bring this administrative revolution, or as I call it, more like administrative nihilism to the UK. And that has long been one of his sort of stated, if you're unfortunate enough to read his Substack, which I am,
No,
this is
dear.
the kind of stuff he's been talking about for some considerable time.
Yeah. He goes on, Ukraine will sign an agreement that will be a win-win for both the United States and the people of Ukraine. So he's holding out for a positive sum game approach where they both do well. That's not at all in Trump's interest. Of course, he's going to say that. I wonder really what Zelenskyy thinks about the realisticness of how realistic it would be for both sides to come out benefiting from any arrangement. I mean, it's possible. Like, that's what should happen, and that's what a responsible government would try and ensure, and a responsible ally would try and ensure. But I just don't think that Trump has that in mind. But
I don't see this. I don't know whether Zelenskyy. I don't know whether Zelenskyy actually sort of believes this, or whether this is something that he has to say publicly. But I think there'll be people advising Zelenskyy who are saying, "Look, you know, this deal is not worth the toilet paper it's written on, and if the US get their claws into Ukraine, they will try to extort as much as they can out of it under the current policy." Everything seems to hinge on Europe. Europe will not treat Ukraine in this way. Of course, European countries want good deals. Of course, they want, you know, their industries to be involved in the reconstruction of Ukraine, but it will not be handled in this kind of mafia-style strong-arm technique. It will be in partnership. At this point, interestingly, Zelenskyy could be described as leader of the free world. That's how John Sweeney put it when he was covering the press conference. Kaylin Robertson's done some great coverage on Twitter of Zelenskyy's press conference. But at this point in time, the West needs to get over the idea that Ukraine is some peripheral country, some post-Soviet nascent democracy, or whatever it is. Ukraine is now central to European survival, European freedom, and the European project. None of these things will survive, I think, in any way that we currently recognize if we don't internalize the idea that Ukraine is a core part of Europe and is intrinsic to our sort of, you know, political and military survival, and economic as well.
Here he says there are no hints about turning off Starlink. However, Ukraine must be ready. So I know they're putting contingencies in place for an alternative to Starlink, but that's interesting. My thoughts on that are probably that the US administration threatened it, but Elon Musk probably went, no, I'd rather not, because I lose a lot of money and it might be legally pretty challenging.
But I don't know about that, Jonathan.
That's purely speculation.
I wouldn't agree with that, because he's previously, you know, said something to upset Carlos Slim, and at a stroke, Starlink was excluded from huge chunks of South America. So Musk, if he's proved anything, is that he is not economically rational either. And there are other motivations there, whether it's his own sort of psychodrama, or, you know, ketamine fueled madness, or other relationships, other strategies that we do not know the detail of. But he's not economically rational in the sense that most business people I've ever dealt with could be described as economically rational.
Yeah. And then what do we have? US wants a ceasefire. They believe a ceasefire will be the end of the war. And of course, you know, I think that speaks to the simplicity of the American approach, maybe. I don't take offense at Trump for his words about a dictator. What's more important to me is what Ukrainians think of me, to which he says 4%, and the real 65% of Ukrainians trust in me is a serious difference. So I think that's quite well couched. I know these are just bullet points, but yeah, that's putting that kind of to bed. It's
tricky, isn't it? Because again, these are sort of words Trump will not see. It'll be like the old Gary Larson cartoon, you know, naughty boy Rover, blah 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 blah, and all the dog hears is his name. All Trump is going to see in all of this thing is, has he been rude to me? Has he, you know, dumped on the deal that we'd agreed, etc., etc. So unfortunately, I don't know how much this will really land.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's going to be about as much about saving face internationally and publicly as well for Zelenskyy. Well, not saving face, but like being able to put himself across. So, like if I'm sometimes I get into spats online with people who, in my life, it's just someone on a Twitter thread or something. Something that means nothing to me, but you almost feel like you've got to put the record right, put it straight. And so you put something out there, you're like, right, okay, I can move on now, type thing. And I guess there's going to be an element of that to Zelenskyy, which is like, I've been slighted and I need to put the record straight publicly, and this is how I do it.
There is, but in the current circumstances, that's probably more something he needs to do to show leadership amongst his peers, his allies. If he harbors any delusions that this is going to change anything with Trump, then alas, no, I don't think it would.
Cool. So, and then we have some more. So this is just the second page here. This is all the rest of it. So 50% more. I'm sure that at least today, the army that is capable of standing is 800,000. North Korea's losses in the war against Ukraine amount to over 4,000 soldiers. We've heard that before. What if we reach an agreement with Russia at some point? It's a very difficult question. The question is where the partners will be at that moment. China can help us with various options to stop Putin. If Beijing wants to play a role in this, we are ready to talk. Now, that is quite fascinating because there have been people that have been hinting about this, that maybe Ukraine could approach China, or at least mention China as playing a role in the future of Ukraine, or involved in the negotiations. Now, whether Ukraine really want that to happen or not, that is a kind of shot across the bow of the US, in my opinion. So where you've got these big, strong China hawks who are like, well, we don't really care about Ukraine, we care about China, even though that everything that the US administration is doing at the moment is to the benefit of Russia and China. It's just bad. But for those last vestiges of China hawks there, this is going to be like, oh, hang on, right? No, we can't have China getting involved here. So that could be a clever bit of statesmanship.
It's clever, yes. It reminds me a little bit of Bilbo Baggins when he's surrounded by the three trolls, and he gets them arguing amongst themselves. I mean, this might be a little bit of that. If it works, that's fantastic, But I think it is important because what the Russian propagandists have been saying in the last couple of days is they've started dumping on China. They've started slagging China off. Yeah. And they've started repeating this line that, oh, right, we're gonna align with our guys, the US, to take down China. How that's going to go down with Xi, goodness only knows. I mean, I'm sure this is not a puppet show that's been sanctioned by Beijing, because it just doesn't make Xi look strong. It's not a good line. So I can't imagine this is part of their psychological operations. This is maybe Russian, how should you put it, hubris coming out. Forgetting how dependent they've made themselves on China, forgetting actually that China is a much greater military power than they are, perhaps less practiced in the field, but certainly it has resources that it could call upon, which Russia has no hope of calling upon. Imagine Hobbit wisdom like that. Just imagine if China really motivated its economy to full-scale military production. I mean, they would wipe Russia out in a heartbeat.
Well, yeah. And there's a lot of talk about the figures they release at the moment have a lot of hidden expenditure on the military industrial complex that are not official. So they're spending in ways that are within this department or that department, and they're trying to hide from the international community how much they're really spending on their military, which, and it makes a mockery of Trump saying, well, two things. First of all, Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense, saying that we have to make savings of 8% every year over 5 years, which amounts to somewhere between 35 and 40% saving. So the DoD is getting cut back. Meanwhile, China and Russia are expanding. and then you can talk about FBI, CIA, all these other departments are being slashed to ribbons. And then Trump said the other day, "Oh, I'm going to be sitting down. One of the first things I'm going to do is sit down with Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin, and we will decide to cut our military budgets in half." And he says, "And I think we can do that. I think they'll agree to that." It's like, really? You really think they're going to agree to that? Absolute nonsense.
Yeah,
like
it's ludicrous.
It's just on another planet, that man. But there you go. If we carry on, because there's a few more to get through. So in America, if America, I don't really believe in it, but things happen, makes an agreement with the Russians about us without us, then there will be no success in this agreement if we do not confirm the terms of this agreement. Absolutely right. That sounds pretty obvious to me, but this is the idea. I mean, I still can't believe that that Trump said publicly the other day that, oh, we don't really need Ukraine. We don't really need Zelenskyy. It's not important. You see, he's in the negotiations. What? You're negotiating the future of that entire country. What do you mean that it's not important there in the negotiations? Absolutely insane. The General Staff and the Ministry of Defense must soon find justice with the 18 to 24 contract. I presume that's talking about how they are trying to get 18 to 24-year-olds to join up, and they've got all these new things in place to give them a pretty good wage, give them access to education and whatnot. And apparently there are 10,000 people who have already applied, so it seems to be working, if that is to be believed.
Well, here's another comment which is interesting. This is just a sort of breaking one, but it's Keir Giles, someone I watch in great detail, who's got his head firmly screwed on. He suggested that the defence review, which is ongoing and which is quite a big fuss,
the UK defence review,
review, there are rumours swirling around that it is about to be suspended because facts on the ground have overtaken the parameters that were set for that defence review. And of course, that defence review had been sticking very much to the idea that there's no room, no capacity to increase defence spending as part of GDP. But that review of defence is intrinsically based on our traditional policy, which is we play a supporting role to the US, and that European and British defence is almost entirely contingent on the US being a key partner within that defensive architecture. So if you take the US out of that, which Merz in Germany is now saying explicitly, that means the entire foundations of the defence review are completely irrelevant and need to be ripped up and rethought. So I think that's an interesting little heads up for maybe an episode we'll do during the week.
Yeah, absolutely. And that doesn't surprise me. I mean, it's going to annoy people like, oh, come on, you've gone through this whole process of getting a defense, essentially audit and review done. Not an audit, but a review, and now you're going to have to start again. But actually, I mean, the whole premise, like everything's been thrown out the window with what the US has done recently and with where we are in the world. So it's just one of those unfortunate situations.
It's entirely sensible to do that. Meanwhile, where is Господин Farage? Where's Mr. Farage?
I love there's a great meme about so for those who don't know, Nigel Farage is the kind of MAGA politician in the UK. He's leader of the Reform UK party, but he's also a member of parliament for Clacton. Clacton is a really poor area that he is supposed to be representing, getting the potholes filled in, sorting out this local thing. And actually he's not been there because he keeps going to America to hobnob with Donald Trump and hang around CPAC conferences and blah blah blah. And so
I was going to say to crawl up Donald Trump's back passage as far as he can possibly get himself. Slightly less generous.
Well, yes. So they're these great memes of him sort of being missing still. One of like the police looking through the undergrowth in a field saying news is still out that the police are still looking for Nigel Farage, who's now been missing for 32 weeks in Clacton, and then like all this stuff. It's great. But anyway, I digress. Let's get back to these points. There's just a few more. It's impossible to end the war with guarantees for Ukraine this week. So that's the claim from Caroline Levitt, who's the spokesperson for the White House, saying that Trump is on course to get these sort of wrapped up within a week. And you're like, really? That's not going to happen. Security guarantees from Europe and the US are step one. So yeah, absolutely. Step number one, they need security guarantees. Without them, there's no point doing any deal at all, because Russia would just come back and take a second bite to the apple. Paliancia, the Peklo and the Ruta are successful. These are homemade drone missiles that the Ukrainians are using. And we are preparing our own ballistic missiles as well. So that's interesting, although that's been on the cards for some time. It's obviously takes a long time to create these things. Sometimes might well be from scratch. After martial law ends, there will be elections in Ukraine. Okay, that's pretty obvious. Ukraine needs 20 more Patriot systems. Ukraine is working on developing an analog of the Patriot. Europe has two armies, Ukrainian and Turkish, and Erdogan can become one of the guarantors of security. I don't quite understand that. I don't know if the translation was lost a little bit there, but this is the understanding that Turkey could play a really important role. And I think that is actually probably quite sensible. Turkey are in NATO. Turkey have previously had thoughts about acceding to the EU, but they also keep reiterating, Erdogan says this very clearly, that Ukraine are entitled to their sovereign integrity, which is very strong rhetoric. You know, that is to say that the 1991 borders are what Ukraine's borders should be. So but at the same time, they also allow Russian money to be laundered through their country. They don't sanction Russia, so they have a foot on both sides of the fence, and so they could play an important role. I don't know what you think.
I think that's tremendously important. I recently had a guest on the channel who is an expert in this, and Turkey, he says, understands this imperial game that's now being played. You know, it's retained the memory of how you sort of play the rules of that sort of 18th, 19th century game of empires type thing, which unfortunately many of us seem to have forgotten, including the British. And one of the reasons they've retained it is because they're much closer to Russia. They have this crucial water routes going through their territory. They have, they're not in the European Union, and actually they're still shunned by the European Union for various reasons. Some good, not so good, and what was absolutely extraordinary, he pointed out, is that when Macron convened this emergency meeting to talk about European security, which didn't, as far as we know, produce any firm results on Monday, he didn't invite Turkey, which is remarkable given its geographical proximity and role in the conflict. Given that Erdogan has shown that he can slap Russia back hard if Turkey's interests are threatened, given the extraordinary support of Turkey for Ukraine, and there are so many reasons why Turkey should have been invited to that and wasn't. I think, if Europe are going to manage this crisis, then I think they need to bring Turkey in as a key ally, rather than leaving it out in the cold with the potential that it could flip-flop and work with other sides.
It's interesting that both Canada and Japan have stated over the last week that they want to be involved in negotiations as well. So, like, everyone's saying, hey, we've all got vested interests here. But yeah, so to continue, the Kursk region will give us the opportunity to exchange it for Ukrainian territories. We knew that was all part of the plans anyway. I will not sign anything that is bad for Ukraine. I know that sounds obvious, but I think it needs reiterating, given that people are worried that he's going to sign away natural resources, and I think there'll be an awful lot of people pressuring him not to, not least the Ukrainians and actually, the Europeans. Before we go on to that last one, something that I've been forgetting to say for about a week, ever since this mineral deal has been on the cards, and I keep forgetting to say that The danger for Ukraine, and I think it was mentioned, is not in this list, but I saw the talk about this somewhere else where he specifically mentioned this. If they do a deal with the US to pay for previous aid packages, so if they do this kind of $500 billion natural resources deal with the US, then every other nation that has given aid to Ukraine will come to Ukraine and say, well, hang on, they've asked for that money back. We've all spent this much money. The Baltics, Europe, UK, Japan, Australia, whoever's given stuff, whoever's put any aid into Ukraine will have a right to come back and say, by the way, you've given, like, the latest is like a 2-to-1 ratio of money, Ukrainian investment to American investment, and there's some crazy parts of that deal. Or if you just take the $500 billion to the $100 billion investment, then that's a 5-to-1 ratio. Then every other nation comes in and says, well, we want a 5-to-1 ratio payback. And that's completely unsustainable. So, but of course, the Americans say, well, it's because they were giving grants, they were giving loans and not this, and we've given this. But actually, Trump was incorrect in stating that the other day. It's just lies and rubbish and nonsense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we probably need to cover it. There's even more stuff breaking, but we'll have to cover it in a future episode. A new statement by Arestovich, of all people, who is I certainly think is a Kremlin agent. So this is going to be interesting to see what he has to say and to see how it's being positioned. Then there is this clear attempt by Trump to force Zelenskyy out of office. This is absolutely out of the Russian playbook. I think one of the reasons Zelenskyy needed to come out and make strong, firm, factual statements, as well as his offer to resign in return for peace and security, i.e. full membership of NATO. Fundamentally, he knows that's not going to happen. He knows the current administration are not going to gift that in any sense. Whether they are, dancing to the tune of Moscow or not, it's just not within, the sort of noises that we hear out of this current administration. It's not where they're going to go with that. So I don't think Zelenskyy will need to resign. I think he also understands that would be a very, very dangerous situation for Ukraine if he did. But the fact that Trump may be seeking all means possible to have Zelenskyy removed from office, this could, first of all, it's incredibly awful. There's no question how awful this actually is. On the other hand, this could backfire in two interesting ways. One is Zelenskyy becomes much more popular even than he is at the moment, and he's already relatively popular. The other one is that if he steps aside, it may be done as part of some kind of deal with Zelenskyy, who is immensely popular and would almost certainly sort of walk an election, especially if he was not going head to head with Zelenskyy. So this could kind of backfire, and I think it also talks to the sort of short-termism on the part of Trump's team, and probably the intense delusions that the Putin team have. So when these two things combined, self-fulfilling delusions and short-term thinking lacking any context, I'm actually quite hopeful that actually they will do and say things that will actually harm their own cause, that is Moscow and Trump.
Just something that's coming out with regard to the German elections is that in the latest projection by broadcaster ZDF, Sarah Wagenknecht Alliance, the BSW, who are pro-Russia, essentially anti-Ukraine, are now on 5%, which is just basically you have to get 5% votes in order to get seats. That's a threshold in order to it's some form of proportional representation. So you need a minimum of 5%. So the FDP, who were previously in coalition, in a traffic light coalition, so this yellow group there, were in with the SPD, and the Greens. Then they had a bit of an argument and the yellow guys left. Well, they're looking at being on 5%, but the latest projection from ZDF is they're no longer on 5%, which means they will be replaced by BSW, who are anti-Ukraine, and the AFD are anti-Ukraine. So there's a considerable worry that there is that kind of populist movement coming through both on the far right and the far left. He says here that will in turn affect how many seats other parties get and whether Friedrich Merz will have to turn to a third party, realistically the Greens, with whom the CDU and CSU disagrees on many subjects in order to form a coalition. The Liberal FDP, which brought down Olaf Scholz's coalition last year, the finance minister Lindner, is on 4.4% according to ZDF, which is not enough to get into parliament. So we'll see how that develops. But it's going to be interesting to, I mean, I would presume that you've got to get over 50% to get a coalition government, but maybe not, maybe due to proportional representation and the number of seats is actually not necessarily the vote share, but the amount of seats you get, and that would be somewhat different because the parties that don't get over 5% don't get seats, so that can change the way it will look. So yeah, it's probably a bit of confusion and it's not simplistic as I thought.
No, but the sheer scale of the FDs, sort of the percentage of votes they're getting is terrifying. But of course, when you look at the map, it's very much aligned with the old East Germany. It's almost
incredible.
Completely.
Yeah, and in fact, let's bring that up for people. I'm sure we've got an image here. Yeah, here it is. This is what Jonathan is talking about. Here's your map there. So the blue is AfD, the black is CDU, and that's kind of what you're talking about in terms of now, of course, that means that the CDU got the largest vote in each of these places, but it won't mean over 50%. That would be largest in a pluralistic landscape. So percentage-wise, that translates to still that kind of spread. But essentially, I assume that most of the places in a first past the post system, they'd be winning like hugely, but it's not first past the post, it's proportional representation. But that's absolutely fascinating. Only in some of these larger cities to the CDU, I presume that's a city there of Bonn, maybe. But that's your Eastern German border there, and that tells you a story, doesn't it?
Yes, well, it wouldn't be Bonn. That was in the west, wasn't it? So where would that be?
I thought Bonn was the capital of Eastern Germany. Have I got that completely wrong?
Wasn't that the capital of the old West Germany? Wasn't it?
Oh, it might be, but capital East. Oh, it's probably Do you know what? East Berlin was capital of East Germany. East Berlin. Yeah, there you go.
Yes, that'd be it.
Yeah.
So that's probably Berlin what you're looking at there, isn't it? Maybe.
Yeah, it is Berlin. Yeah, you're right. That's Berlin.
East,
No, you're right. That's Berlin. Yeah, sorry. How thick of me.
No, it is late on a Sunday evening.
But that's that, and that will explain why you've got the Green Party doing well there as well, because that'd be part of a kind of urban elite type place, maybe suburbs of Berlin. But yes, sorry, that is me.
But surrounded by a sea of far right sentiment. It's extraordinary how sort of 30 years of democratic freedom seems not to have really cut in there.
Yeah, stretching westwards as well, past Berlin and whatnot. So yeah, interesting and worrying for the future of Europe in terms of the rise of far right populism, which we see in many other countries as well. It's going to be fascinating to see what happens in the UK in 3.5 years' time, or when it is, whenever it will be, 4 years, I don't know. But yeah, so there is that to contend with. But luckily, the UK is going to be stable at least for the next however many years, and that's good for Ukraine. And this will be good for Ukraine because you will now get hopefully pro-Ukrainian stability within Germany. So there are some good things to take away from the situation at the moment. But yeah, so there you go. That's what's been going on tonight. An awful lot of news concerning the conference or whatever you want to call it that took place in Kiev today, and there'll be a lot of not fallout, or there might be fallout, but there'll be a lot of analysis of what Zelenskyy has said, plus the many others. So people like Budanov are saying quite a lot as well. That I've got a few things lined up tomorrow to talk about with regard to Budanov. But really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, what I've noticed as well, and this is not surprising, is that the audience, the interest, the engagement in what we're talking about is definitely, dramatically higher than it was a few weeks ago. In fact, this is comparable to the summer when the Kursk offensive kicked off, and there was a period of about 2 weeks of absolutely intense interest in what was happening in Ukraine, and it just saw this massive expansion of the audience. Even though a lot of people are putting out more videos because there's more things happening, you still get much better engagement. And I think I'm seeing this at the moment as well. If Ukraine can use this moment of increased engagement, increased interest to get its message across, and if we can do the same, that is not necessarily a bad thing.
Yeah, you ride the waves. It's interesting concerning the conference today. Just a couple of things I'm going to play you. First of all, this is from Donald Trump, and just understand the difference here. Oh, you can not hear that? Can you hear that?
No, I can't hear that.
Oh, drat and blast. Let's just hang on. Because I do want to play this to you. I'm going to present this in a different way, and we're going to do that. There we go. Right, you should be able to hear this now. Here we go.
I watch this MSNBC, which is a threat to democracy, actually. They're stone cold mean, but they're stuttering.
But just to reiterate that, he's saying MSNBC is a threat to democracy because they're mean to him. They're stone cold mean.
They're all screwed up. They're all mentally screwed up. They don't know what. Their ratings have gone down the tubes. I don't even talk about CNN. CNN's sort of like, I don't know. They're pathetic, actually. But MSNBC was mean. Their ratings are absolutely down. This Rachel Maddow, what does she have? She's got nothing. Nothing. She took a sabbatical where she worked
like
one
a
day
pantomime.
a week. They paid her a lot of money. It's no ratings. I should go against her in the ratings because I'll tell you, she gets no ratings. All she does is to talk about Trump, 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 all different subjects, Trump this, Trump that. But these people are really, I mean, they lie. They shouldn't be allowed to lie every night. They are really a vehicle of the Democrat Party. They should be paying. Is that Gordon? Yes, is that Gordon? The great Gordon Chang?
So he's basically, they shouldn't be allowed to do this. They shouldn't be allowed to criticize me. They're just an arm of the Democrat Party without, like, he's just projecting because, of course, Fox News is the arm of the Republican Party completely. In fact, it's just his propaganda channel. But he keeps saying stuff like this, like CNN, they're the enemy of the people, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, it gets really galling when JD Vance comes across to Europe and attacks us for freedom of speech and blah, 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 when everything that the present Trump administration trying to do appears to be shutting down speech. So it's interesting to hear Kaylin Robertson, who I interviewed the other day, fantastic interview, talk about how I was in the second row of the Zelenskyy conference today, and I watched right-wing American media ask him critical questions. At the same time, Trump is banning critical media from his conferences. He's also banned critical media from the Pentagon and from the White House, or at least changing the way they operate in the White House. At the same time, Trump is banning critical media from his conferences. There's more free press in Kiev than in DC. So the dictator line is insane. It's projection. And there's a lot to be said about that. How, like you said earlier, Jonathan, in some sense, Zelenskyy and Ukraine are representing freedom and liberty here in many more ways than I think we give them credit for. And there is a good deal of freedom there that possibly isn't reflected in the United States. And yet you could argue that the United States has traditionally been the beacon of democracy and freedom to which countries like Ukraine are aspiring. But actually, the reality is very different.
And traditionally were. I mean, Ukraine was one of the most pro-US countries in Europe, but Ukrainians do not like betrayal. Ukrainians do not like lies, in fact, and hypocrisy. So that view of, I would say, deep admiration for the US, that's being burnt before our eyes. That goodwill is being sort of consumed, and it's turning to a sense of betrayal, and that will escalate. the key now is not necessarily to rescue that, it's beyond our control, but to prevent that sense of resentment and perhaps even loathing from extending to European countries and European allies. Now is the moment where we step in and we show that there are still democratic values which are worth something. We still stand for them, and we're willing to invest more in those rather than just talking the talk. So on many respects, it's now Europe's time to sink or swim.
Yeah. If we go through some thanks and then sort of wrap things up, we're also going to talk about what fundraisers we may or may not be doing. So we're going to say, so thanks, Living Life 941. It seems like Russia's picked up the initiative again. I fear they are going to be at the Dnipro Oblast by April at the latest. I'm not so sure. I don't know how much they've got left in the tank, but I've been saying that for an awful long time. And yeah, I think that they're struggling and exhausting themselves, but it also depends how much assistance Ukraine gets and whether some of their weapons that they keep threatening to be coming online are able to be utilized, etc., etc. Yeah, so that's my tuppence on that. Michael Vuja gifting 5 ATP Geopolitics memberships. It's really generous, Michael. Thank you so much, all the way from Canada. Vadim Orlov gifting 10 ATP Geopolitics memberships. Super generous, Vadim. Thank you very much for that. This is Tarim Makij. I keep hearing that European countries will only provide peacekeepers if there are American security guarantees that I can't see Trump ever agreeing to. Do you think Europe will provide peacekeepers without security guarantees? That's a really great question.
It's just changing by the hour. You know, if you asked that question last week, you'll get one answer, which is no, they're going to hold out security guarantees. This week, tomorrow, this is all changing so rapidly that I don't think we can say that what held to be true and a fact last week is gonna be the same next week.
One of the plans is, and I think this is part of what the British and French are suggesting, is that the Europeans provide boots on the ground, but they will need American air support. And I think that could be something that the Americans could sign up to. That's more plausible than boots on the ground. I think, you know, that's certainly a possibility that I think could well happen. So that's one way around that. Thank you very much, Taryn. It's a great question. Goose Springsteen saying that working a graveyard shit, so I unfortunately can't follow the stream live, but we're looking forward to catching up. Thank you. Often has many questions for us. And one quick thought, as I can't resist, ideally the CDU will be able to form a coalition with only a single other party. The more parties, the less stable it's likely to be, which is worse for Ukraine. Yes, I mean, ideally, I would want them forming with the Greens, actually. The Greens have been the most solidly behind, which is kind of weird to think the Green Party would be quite hawkish on war and the military-industrial complex, but they have. The reality is that in Germany, they're quite a bit more of a mature Green Party in terms of how long they've been around and therefore kind of maturing their policy approaches. And for example, Annalena Baerbock as the foreign minister has been exceptionally good for Ukraine, and I think is a real boon for the Germans. And I'd like to see her continuing in that position, but I don't know how likely that is. And Mitch Mazarol, can we get an update on active fundraising campaigns that both you gents are working on? Thanks very much, Mitch, by the way. And
good idea.
Absolutely. Just to let people know that the update, and this, unfortunately, I asked Jonathan Fink to come on board with this Jiggers Paul because he was there. He's met these guys, but it happened like just straight away. Suddenly they're like, "Oh, we got the landing page sorted for you," and then it just went live. Like, so we didn't have time to sort that out. So we are almost halfway there already, and it only kind of went live 1.5 days ago or something. So that's
incredible. Wow.
Incredible. So that's really, really good. And thank you so much for those people who are helping to donate to thermal drones, DJI Mavic 3T. So these are thermal drones, which makes them quite a bit more expensive. So we're part of a campaign that is raising 300,000 in total, and that's 150,000 coming from Ukraine and Ukrainians and 150,000 coming from abroad, so matching. And just to remind you, if you do donate, press the donate button. Make sure that you press copy ATP for Triad and put that in the reference to the payment that you make. in one of these ways. That's really important, and that's how it gets logged to our project. But that is linked in my description box below. Anything from you, Jonathan?
I've been away, so still producing videos, but it's been a little bit difficult keeping up with everything plus the news. I certainly want to get on board with this, but that's something that will take shape through the course of the week. Apart from that, however, we are now finally, after the trip to Ukraine, put our schedule out a little bit on the documentary film that we're making, but that is now on track. As one of the people who may be watching this, maybe not, but who donated to that campaign suggested creating a campaign total page, share more updates about the documentary film project. That's absolutely something I will be doing. We also are planning a lot more events this year. So we've got a fundraiser for the documentary. We've got a fundraiser for being able to support a lot more live events and filming them, including hopefully one at the UK Parliament coming up soon. And we hope to film most of those. As long as they're not on Chatham House rules, we want to take Cameron and film everything that we do, put it on the channel, but really take sort of the show on the road to help drum up sort of European support for Ukraine and for their own security and stiffen spines and all that kind of stuff. So those are the kind of campaigns we got ongoing at the moment. Very much fighting the informational war in both of those, but we want to do more of the drone stuff. We want to do more of the Cars for Ukraine stuff as well. So that means we'll do a lot more of these live streams, and we'll link them to fundraisers.
Absolutely. A few more just questions and points just to finish off. 300 billion of frozen Russian assets must be used. Absolutely, 100%. And I think there's going to be moves afoot to do that. I'm fairly sure that's going to be top of the European agenda, to be perfectly honest. Silicon Curtain, does the Ukrainian Rada need to ratify any peace agreement? Zelenskyy has talked about this, and he talks about, I can't make an agreement that the Ukrainian people won't agree to. I know it's not quite that, but there's going to be a lot of what Zelensky's going to be thinking about is it popular?
And he certainly can't sign a deal on Ukraine's natural resources. He does not have the mandate to do that. He does not have the legal powers to sign away Ukraine's resources in perpetuity. So, the US, this is again extraordinary naivety. And I would say the scary tendency towards informal power, to think that Zelenskyy could just sign a piece of paper without properly reading it, and that would all be fine and legal. I mean, it's not just awful, it's also absurd and amateurish and dumb as a brick. And then to get sort of petulant and upset that he wouldn't sign it on the spot. We're dealing with amateurish gangsters here. There's no other word for it.
Yeah, and it's depressing when you get people like Stephen Witkoff, who's this billionaire that's now doing all this wheeling and dealing on behalf of the US over the head of Ukraine, talking about I don't know if it's in this particular one, but he's talking about NATO expansionism being the cause for the war. And it's like he's spouting actual Russian propaganda. And it's just deeply, deeply depressing that the heart of negotiations is someone who appears to be aligned with Russian propaganda. It's just not acceptable.
I was reading that earlier, and it's disgraceful. And he's like, well, whoever started the war, whoever was culpable, and Russia was provoked. It's like, this is Kremlin BS 101.
It's just insane that they've done this like 180 switch. Final point I'm going to make. Kerry Pomo said right at the beginning of this video, I think America fudged the last 30 years as the world police, sadly, and Europe also fudged the peace dividend. Blame is on us all, but with the focus on arming Europe with European arms. Yep, the last bit, don't have a problem with. The world police thing I find interesting. Now, I absolutely love Team America World Police, which is this fantastic Trey Parker, Matt Stone, who made South Park. They made the one with puppets where they're like America the World Police, and they go around like sorting out King John ill and whatever back a decade or so ago. And it's playing on this idea that the Americans just go around the world being the world police. And that was something I kind of used to adhere to. But I now understand fully that the US is not the world police and never has been. There's a great statement by, what was it? Guy that wrote a book back in, I think, the 1910s, or was it 1930s? Was formerly in the American Army. Said basically we went around the world and we got involved here, and we got involved here for the sugar barons, we got involved here for this, we got involved there for that. And he was explaining that basically there's no difference between the American Armed Forces and, you know, kind of not racketeering, but like the quote was something like, who was a famous gangster? Al Capone. He said Al Capone used to, like, you know, rule in like 3 districts of New York or whatever it was, but we did it on 5 continents. The point is that the US, and I would argue, and in fact I've written articles on this, is that any armed forces are working in the national interests of their government, and they're not actually doing world policing. And when it aligns with morality and looks like they're doing world police, they're actually really doing it. It's just lucky when it morally aligns. But what usually is at the heart of any action internationally from any government is global strategy, foreign policy strategy. So the US has never been the world police, but we've interpreted it that because we think they're going around the world, you know, that was a weapons of mass destruction. We want to kick out Saddam Hussein. No, we want to get oil companies into Iraq. Like, why did they attack Libya? Why Syria? You know, why not Zimbabwe? Well, Zimbabwe didn't have any natural resources. That's why they were okay. So it's not just policing the whole world. It is looking like you're policing places, but actually what's underlying it is the strategic objectives. I'm not, you know, so I think we need to be quite realistic about why countries do what they do around the world. And it's not always about, I think it's very rarely about morality unless they're sorting out an earthquake disaster place with humanitarian aid. You know, if you're piling your troops into somewhere, you want to make sure that's in your strategic interest to do so. Anyway, it's just
my final thought on that is, I think it's only when you enter a period of extreme instability such as this, you come to appreciate what the sort of Pax Americana actually was. Yes, there's numerous mistakes, and yes, there's some pretty horrific and egregious hypocrisy over the years. But by and large, global free trade, enforced by the strength of the maritime US and a global rules-based order, which was a real thing. There'll be lots of comments saying it was not a real thing. Yes, it's a real thing, and it has maintained a growth in prosperity, longevity, and a steady accumulation of scientific knowledge and technological knowledge since the Second World War. Well, that's over, and I think for those who want to label the last sort of 70 years as a massive failure, I think we also need to focus on the positives of what that brought.
Yeah, and this is actually the quote. If I can say this would be a good place to leave it. So Smedley D. Butler from War is Racket. This is such a good quote. I spent 33 years and 4 months in active military service, and during that period, I spent most of my time as a high-class muscle man for big business, for Wall Street and the bankers. In short, I was a racketeer, a gangster for capitalism. I helped make Mexico, and especially Tampico, safe for American oil interests in 1914. I helped make Haiti and Cuba a decent place for the National City Bank boys to collect revenues in. I helped in the raping of half a dozen Central American republics for the benefit of Wall Street. I helped purify Nicaragua for the International Banking House of Brown Brothers in 1902 to 1912. I brought light to the Dominican Republic for the American sugar interests in 1916. I helped make Honduras right for the American fruit companies in 1903. In China in 1927, I helped to see it that Standard Oil went on its way unmolested. Looking back on it, I might have given Al Capone a few hints. The best he could do was to operate his racket in 3 districts. I operated on 3 continents. Right, which I think is a phenomenal quote there. However, and this is the important part, where the Ukraine war is different is that this is a war that is in the strategic interests of all the allies of Ukraine, massively, hugely in our security interests. And it is massively, massively morally good to do this as well. So this was a bully attacking a weaker neighbor. Like the moral calculation from us as individuals is clear. So we help Ukraine because it's morally in our interest to do so. We see the moral clarity there. And what's good news as well is it's in our nation's geopolitical and strategic interests to support Ukraine. And there's a perfect marriage of morality and strategy. And that's what differentiates us in this conflict from, say, the sorts of conflicts that Smedley Butler was talking about, where they were going around the world sorting out, business interests for the US. And actually, you can argue where Trump is going back to now is that very transactional business thing, rather than the longer term strategic outlook and the moral outlook that we're interested in. So anyway, there you go.
Pleasure speaking again. So
yep.
We'll do more of these, and we'll do a lot more of these live streams. I think with things speeding up, it's incredibly important. Sorry, something kicked off there. Incredibly important to keep doing this and not just focus on the informational side of the war, but also, helping the kinetic side too.
Absolutely. And so I'll be in touch with you and see if you can come on board with Jigger's Paw. But in the meantime, check out the links in both of our descriptions to help out with different fundraisers. Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you to the live chat. And thank you for your very kind contributions to support the channel. And please check out those links as mentioned. In the meantime, Slava Ukraini.
Heroям slava.
Take care, y'all.
Cheers.